A Course in
What?
with Cynthia Morgan.
Hi, course friends. Welcome to A Course in What? I'm Cynthia Morgan, and this is our third podcast episode. And this is a podcast in which I read and discuss the text of A Course in Miracles. And I just want to thank you for joining me today and also remind you that this podcast is a weekly free podcast that's up every Tuesday morning. And I also want to say thank you so much to the listener who gave me a lovely review on iTunes. I was really surprised by that. And I just want you to know, whoever you are, that I really, really appreciated that. It was really sweet. So thank you. And perhaps the last episode may have brought up more questions for you than it did answers, because we were delving into the metaphysics of A Course in Miracles, and that can oftentimes be difficult to understand. And in fact, I had someone contact me with a question after listening to the last episode, and she asked me the one question that everybody asks who is a serious student of A Course in Miracles at one point or another, and maybe it entered your mind as you were listening to the metaphysics in the last episode, and that is, how can oneness separate? If God is all there is, then in her mind, she said the separation has to be of God. And it's a really, really good question. I certainly asked that question many times and pondered it in a lot of the Course in Miracles workshops I went to with Kenneth Wapnick. It was a question that he got in every single workshop I ever attended. And in fact, Jesus addresses that question in A Course in Miracles. And he addressed the question to Bill Thetford the answer to Bill Thetford, because Bill Thetford was the one who posed that question to Jesus. And so I'm going to just read you how Jesus responded to that question. It is reasonable to ask how the mind could ever have made the ego. In fact, it is the best question you could ask. There is, however, no point in giving an answer in terms of the past, because the past does not matter, and history would not exist if the same errors were not being repeated in the present. And then he addresses it in the clarification for terms, and that is in the Manual for Teachers in the back of A Course in Miracles. He addresses it one more time by saying this: the ego will demand many answers that this course does not give. It does not recognize as questions the mere form of a question to which an answer is impossible. The ego may ask, how did the impossible occur? To what did the impossible happen? And may ask this in many forms. Yet there is no answer, only an experience. Seek only this, and do not let theology delay you. Who asks you to define the ego and explain how it arose can be but he who thinks it real, and seeks by definition to ensure that its elusive nature is concealed behind the words that seem to make it so. There is no definition for a lie that serves to make it true. So, basically, Jesus is addressing it because he knows that his students at some time or another will ask that question. After all, he doesn't underestimate how smart we are, or how smart our ego is. And so he does say it's the best question you could ever ask. The problem, though, with asking that question is you're really making a statement. By asking the question, you're saying, I believe I am an ego, and now I want you to tell me how I exist. And so you get caught in the trap of the ego simply by asking the question. The Course doesn't ever really answer the question. And in fact, I don't know that any spiritual path answers that question. It's the same question as, why did Eve take a bite of the apple and a whole new world arose from that? In Gnosticism, I'm no expert in Gnosticism at all, but I think it was like Sophia was the fallen angel. I could totally be wrong about that. But then the world arose out of Sophia. And so it's the same idea that something occurred. And I think you have to let go of your linear perception of the world and of time in order to understand it a little more. Because A Course in Miracles says that this world, the dream of separation, happened in an instant. And so from our perspective, that instant is millions and millions of years. When you're stuck in that instant, it appears to be linear. But the Course is saying, from the point of view of an eternity, it was simply a thought that was healed or corrected in that same instant that it occurred. So, why did that thought occur? I don't know. And there are other sort of spiritual teachings that just say oneness wanted to experience something other than oneness. We wanted to experience life outside of God. I mean, obviously, I don't have the answer to that question, but I will tell you this, that if you overanalyze it too much, it becomes a trick and keeps you stuck in the separation, because the Course says that the ego analyzes and the Holy Spirit accepts. And this doesn't mean that you shouldn't analyze it, that you shouldn't intellectually try to make sense of it for yourself. I mean, after all, we have this huge course, which is really dense, and you have to analyze and study it. And so it's okay to kind of study the metaphysics and try to make sense of it for yourself. But I found for myself that after all of that going back and forth and trying to understand how the impossible could happen, at some point, that over analyzing led me to eventually kind of a surrender into an experience of understanding what that meant. And it will lead you to an experience, because the experience is beyond time and space, and that experience will help you to understand what it means. And I know this probably doesn't satisfy your ego and your analytical side, but I get that. I think the best way to begin to understand and make sense of these metaphysics is to think about comparing it to your nighttime dream. So when you fall asleep at tonight and you have a dream that, let's say, you're in the Amazon, and then you wake up, but you're actually in Los Angeles, that you weren't actually in the Amazon. So it's the same thing here. So we fell asleep in our cushy bed oneness of God, and we had this instant, momentary dream of being in this world. And the Course is saying that we then, once we wake up, we recognize exactly the reality of the situation that we were dreaming. But within the dream, we can't even begin to understand this sense of separation, because that's our only reality. It's once we become lucid dreamers that we can begin to make our way back to the oneness of our reality. When the Course talks about the world being an illusion, that's really what it's saying. It's just a dream. And even though there cannot be any separation, there's an illusion of separation. And maybe that's a better way of putting it, that this world is just an illusion of separation. I hope that that answers your question a little bit. You know, she had said something like, but I believe that God is in everything. And what the Course would say is that there's a line in the Course that says, God knows not form. And so if we were created in God's image, then we weren't created as human beings in the image of Him as a human being. We were created as a consciousness of love, a consciousness of mind, that sort of thing. And so that's our true reality. And so when we think about God being in the world, And she was saying that the world reflects to her that God consciousness. She sees God in everything. And that's because she's looking at the world through God consciousness. And so when you look at the world through God consciousness, you see God in everything. But you can also look at the world through the sight of the ego. And then the world becomes a place of fear and separation and anxiety and war and everything that pretty much is going on. And so the world is like a mirror, and it's just reflecting back to us the consciousness with which we're looking at that mirror, at that world. And so, for instance, nature to one person could be very beautiful, and they could have an amazing mystical experience, a divine experience in nature that brings them to a holier place in their own lives or in their own consciousness. But that same nature scene, let's say a wooded area, somebody else could die in there and get lost and starve to death. And so that would not be a holy place for that person or that person's family. It would be a place of loneliness and fear. And so that's what it means that when the Course says that the world is just a reflection, projection makes perception. So the world then is reflecting our consciousness, our ego consciousness, our God consciousness, and that's then what we see in the world as well. I hope that helps to clarify how can oneness separate. And so again, just think of it like a nighttime dream at sleep. It's an illusion of separation. You're still at one with God. So let's move on from that. And we're going to finish the last segment of the preface. And this is the part that says what it says. The first two sections of the preface, Helen wrote herself. And the last section, this section, was scribed. In other words, it was written by Jesus. And you can kind of begin to tell because it's a little harder to understand from here on out. And so the rest of the course is scribed. All right, so let's continue on with our study and with what it says. Nothing real can be threatened. Nothing unreal exists. Herein lies the peace of God. This is how A Course in Miracles begins. It makes a fundamental distinction between the real and the unreal, between knowledge and perception. Knowledge is truth under one law, the law of love or God. Truth is unalterable, eternal, and unambiguous. It can be unrecognized, but it cannot be changed. It applies to everything that God created, and only what He created is real. It is beyond learning because it is beyond time and process. It has no opposite, no beginning, and no end. It merely is. So you may remember that A Course in Miracles is a non-dualistic thought system, meaning only truth is true. But the Course is written to us in a non-dualistic way, understanding that only truth is true, but that we are caught in a world of perception. We're caught in the dream world. So the Course speaks to somebody who is in the belief system of being separate from God and separate from others. So that's why the Course says it makes a fundamental distinction between the real and the unreal. In other words, between God and ego, between knowledge and perception. Knowledge in the Course always refers to oneness or God, and perception is a term that's always synonymous with the ego. Continuing with the text. The world of perception, on the other hand, is the world of time, of change, of beginnings and endings. It is based on interpretation, not on facts. It is the world of birth and death, founded on the belief in scarcity, loss, separation, and death. It is learned rather than given, selective in its perceptual emphasis, unstable in its functioning, and inaccurate in its interpretations. Again, the world of perception is the ego's world. The ego's world is a world of change, of beginnings and endings. There is no change in oneness. There is no change in God. So these are attributes of the ego's world. Continuing with the text. From knowledge and perception, respectively, two distinct thought systems arise which are opposite in every respect. In the realm of knowledge, no thoughts exist apart from God, because God and His creation share one will. The world of perception, however, is made by the belief in opposites and separate wills, in perpetual conflict with each other and with God. What perception sees and hears appears to be real, because it permits into awareness only what conforms to the wishes of the perceiver. This leads to a world of illusions, a world which needs constant defense precisely because it is not real. So again, from knowledge and perception, two distinct thought systems arise. From the Holy Spirit and from the ego, two distinct thought systems arise, which are opposite in every respect. And so you could really take that one step further and say that not only did two distinct thought systems arrive, but then two distinct experiences in the world arise. Because again, depending on how you're perceiving the world, meaning who is going to interpret your life and the experiences that you're seeing, you always have a choice in perception. You can always view the world through your ego, and you can always view the world through the Holy Spirit or the vision of love. Your experience in the world is dependent on who is guiding your perceptions. When the Course says, what perception sees and hears appears to be real because it permits into awareness only what conforms to the wishes of the perceiver. Now, this is a reference to the work of Freud. Freud said that wish fulfillment comes from unconscious desires, and he was the one who coined that term wish fulfillment. And because A Course in Miracles is based in psychology, remember Helen and Bill were psychologists, so there are these references to psychology. I mean, obviously the ego, that is, a psychology term. And so once we begin to understand that, we can see some of these psychology ideas weaved throughout A Course in Miracles. This idea of wish fulfillment occurs in the unconscious desires of the ego. This world would be one big ego wish fulfillment. And just like a wish in your dreaming is an illusion, that is the same thing that's occurring here. This leads to a world of illusions, the Course says, a world which needs constant defense precisely because it is not real. Dreams obviously can only happen when we're asleep. And so wish fulfillment can only happen when we're asleep. So continuing with the text. When you have been caught in the world of perception, you are caught in a dream. You cannot escape without help, because everything your senses show merely witnesses to the reality of the dream. God has provided the answer, the only way out, the true helper. It is the function of His voice, His Holy Spirit, to mediate between two worlds. He can do this because, while on the one hand, He knows the truth, on the other, He also recognizes our illusions, but without believing in them. It is the Holy Spirit's goal to help us escape from the dream world by teaching us how to reverse our thinking and unlearn our mistakes. Forgiveness is the Holy Spirit's great learning aid in bringing this thought reversal about. However, the Course has its own definition of what forgiveness really is, just as it defines the world in its own way. When the Course says God has provided the answer, the only way out, the true helper, that, of course, is a reference to the Holy Spirit. And Jesus is a symbol of the Holy Spirit. So when you're thinking about this way out, you can use Jesus as a symbol. You can use the idea of the Holy Spirit as a symbol. But this is God's answer to the problem of separation. So you may recall from the metaphysics, the moment we had, or instant that we had the thought of separation, we were given the answer with a capital A. And that is the Holy Spirit that helps reinterpret our experiences to bring us home. In other words, what we use to keep us separate, the Holy Spirit uses to awaken us. And in the end, when it says forgiveness is the Holy Spirit's great learning aid, but the Course has its own definition of forgiveness. In A Course in Miracles, to forgive is to overlook. And what do we overlook? We overlook the belief in separation. We overlook the ego's interpretation of the events that are occurring in our lives. And that's what it means to forgive. And we'll talk more and more about forgiveness because it's such a huge part of A Course in Miracles. It's really the means for a miracle. And so I'll get into it more and more, but in a nutshell, that's what forgiveness means. It means to overlook the ego. Continuing with the text. The world we see merely reflects our own internal frame of reference, the dominant ideas, wishes, and emotions in our minds. Projection makes perception. We look inside first, decide the kind of world we want to see, and then project that world outside, making it the truth as we see it. We make it true by our interpretations of what it is we are seeing. If we are using perception to justify our own mistakes, our anger, our impulses to attack, our lack of love in whatever form it may take, we will see a world of evil, destruction, malice, envy, and despair. All this we must learn to forgive, not because we are being good and charitable, but because what we are seeing is not true. We have distorted the world by our twisted defenses and are therefore seeing what is not there. As we learn to recognize our perceptual errors, we also learn to look past them or forgive. At the same time, we are forgiving ourselves, looking past our distorted self-concepts to the self with a capital S that God created in us and as us. So when the Course says we have distorted the world by our twisted defenses, what that means is that we are trying to defend, or our ego is trying to defend, what isn't real. And that's why it's twisted. We keep trying to defend that this is our reality, and it's all twisted. What's real is unreal, and what's unreal is real, becomes real to us. And then at the end, when it says, at the same time we are forgiving ourselves, looking past our distorted self-concepts to the self that God created in us and as us. Ultimately, all we need to forgive is our belief in separation. And so we need to forgive ourselves for having that belief that we've separated from God. The Course tells us that all of us hold unconscious guilt over this belief that we've separated from God. That's our ultimate job, is to forgive ourselves. But how do we begin to forgive ourselves? We begin to forgive ourselves by forgiving those people outside of us, those people in our daily lives, the woman at the bank or the grocery store, or our children, or our parents, or our spouses, or whomever, our bosses, whoever in our lives brings us upset or unforgiveness. Those are the people we begin to forgive. And by forgiving those people, we then learn that we are forgiven. In other words, if I'm forgiving you and overlooking the separation, that what you're doing to me isn't real on some level, I'm remembering that the separation isn't true for me. Therefore, as I forgive you, I begin to forgive myself. I ask clients on their first session 2 questions. And the first question is, what do you most regret? And the second question is, who are you holding the most unforgiveness towards? And I've had to clarify that question by saying, except for yourself. Because over the years, when I would ask that question, 80% of the people said myself. And they're right. We are holding the most unforgiveness towards ourselves. Nobody crucifies us as much as we crucify ourselves. But I'll say, come up with somebody else, and inevitably people can find somebody that they're holding unforgiveness towards. And that's the person that we begin to work at forgiving. And one of the exercises I do with my clients is I have them then write 70 times a day for 7 days, I forgive you, Mom, or I forgive you, Dad, or I forgive you, Joe. And you just notice as you begin to write this, just what's occurring in your mind. Usually by the end of the 7 days, there's a complete release and healing that's occurred just by doing that simple exercise. And I've actually termed it the forgiveness phenomenon, because I've noticed in my practice that when people forgive, they inevitably hear from that person, even if it's been years, or they'll just run into that person. I've had people who have literally run into, bumped into the person that they were working on forgiving that week after my session outside, after having not seen these people for months or even years. Or I can't tell you how many times people have left a session after a forgiveness session and they've called me up and said, you'll never believe who left me a voicemail during that session. Because there's only one of us here. There's only one mind. And when we begin to forgive, it creates miracles in our lives. It has an energy of bringing people back in. It's it's a space of love, and we're all attracted to that space of love. We're all repulsed by anger, by grievances, by separation, and those are the things that keep us separate. But when we begin to forgive, we become very appealing. We become very attractive. And obviously, I'm not talking about on the physical level, although I think that can occur too, but it happens on a deeper level. So I've always been meaning to write a book about all of these experiences that I've had, that I've just ended up coining the term the forgiveness phenomenon. So if there is somebody in your life that you're holding unforgiveness towards, I would say do this exercise for 7 days, 70 times a day. Just write, I forgive you, and just notice what comes up as you do the exercise. Okay, continuing with the text. Sin is defined as lack of love. Since love is all there is, sin in the sight of the Holy Spirit is a mistake to be corrected, rather than an evil to be punished. Our sense of inadequacy, weakness, and incompletion comes from the strong investment in the scarcity principle that governs the whole world of illusions. From that point of view, we seek in others what we feel is wanting in ourselves. We, quote, love another in order to get something ourselves. That, in fact, is what passes for love in the dream world. There can be no greater mistake than that, for love is incapable of asking for anything. So sin in traditional Christianity is defined as an immoral act. In A Course in Miracles, it's defined as a lack of love. Again, A Course in Miracles is a course in shifting your perception. It doesn't dictate any rules of behavior. There are no rules for behavior. So that's an important principle, a guiding principle as you're reading the course. It's not telling you what to do or not do. It's telling you to forgive in your mind, to see sin as a lack of love. And once you change that perception in your mind, you will naturally be guided behaviorally in your body as a correct response. So many of us are acting and behaving based on the ego's interpretation of our lives and based on fear. So the result is separation. The result is guilt, shame, all kinds of things. But if we go back to our mind and replace that with a new vision of the Holy Spirit, our behavior in the world changes. Sin is defined as a lack of love. And there are only 2 thoughts in the mind of the one Son, and that is the thought of fear, the ego, or the thought of love, the Holy Spirit. So at any time, we're either thinking with fear or we're thinking with love. Either thought system will have a different result, meaning a different experience in the world and in our body as well. If we understand that there are only two thoughts in the mind, love and fear, when we see somebody in fear, we are asked to view that as a call for love. So ultimately, there's really only love or a call for love. And the natural response to a call for love is to give love in return. The problem is we're using the ego to guide our interpretation. So when someone attacks us, that's how we view it, we don't see that as a call for love. Our ego naturally sees it as an attack and we attack back. But the Course is saying you need to redefine what people are doing in those moments. And once we begin to respond with love to that call for love, that's also how we begin to heal ourselves. We begin to learn that if I'm responding to their fear with love, I'm understanding that I am love. And when the Course talks about the scarcity principle that governs the world of illusions, that's really the guiding principle of the ego that says you've left God, you're a bad person, and now you have nothing. And when we walk around this world, we feel this sense of lack. No matter what we get, we still feel like something is missing. And it is. It's our remembrance of oneness with God. But the ego tells us that it's a real lack in us because we've left God. And so the ego will always tell us to look to fulfill that feeling in the world. And not only on top of that, but the ego will tell us that there isn't enough in the world. So we already have this feeling of lack. And then on top of that, we have this feeling that there isn't even enough for us. And this is the guiding principle of the ego. The Course says the ego says, seek and do not find. Continuing with the text. Only minds can really join, and whom God has joined, no man can put asunder. It is, however, only at the level of Christ's mind that true union is possible, and has, in fact, never been lost. The little I seeks to enhance itself by external approval, external possessions, and external, quote, love. The capital S self that God created needs nothing. It is forever complete, safe, loved, and loving. It seeks to share rather than to get, to extend rather than project. It has no needs and wants to join with others out of their mutual awareness of abundance. When the Course uses the word extend, that's always an attribute of the Holy Spirit. You'll see that throughout the Course. The Holy Spirit extends, extending ourselves to our brother, the extensions of our mind. And then when it uses the word project, that's always an ego attribute. Continuing with the text. The special relationships of the world are destructive, selfish, and childishly egocentric. Yet if given to the Holy Spirit, these relationships can become the holiest things on earth, the miracles that point the way to return to heaven. The world uses its special relationships as a final weapon of exclusion and a demonstration of separateness. The Holy Spirit transforms them into perfect lessons in forgiveness and an awakening from the dream. Each one is an opportunity to let perceptions be healed and errors corrected. Each one is another chance to forgive oneself by forgiving the other. And each one becomes still another invitation to the Holy Spirit and to the remembrance of God. Special relationships in A Course in Miracles don't mean what we think they mean. It's not like this special person who is perfect for me and lovely and unique In A Course in Miracles, special relationships, the term special has to do with the ego. And because special is a form of separation, we've separated this thing out to label it as something special. So it's a form of fragmentation of the oneness. And so special relationships are those things that we use to placate that scarcity principle. So special relationships can be, they can be people, they can be substances, anything that we use that turns into an addiction is a special relationship. And that's why the Course says special relationships of the world are destructive, selfish, and childishly egocentric. And then it goes on to say, yet given to the Holy Spirit, these are the means with which we can awaken. And so using that theme of addiction, we can see, we've all heard the stories, and maybe you've had the experience that something that you used to keep you separate and in addiction is, once surrendered to the Holy Spirit, or however you see that in your mind, can become a means of people awakening to a greater self. So you hear those stories in recovery a lot. It's like when in 12-step, when people celebrate their birthday, it's like being reborn, and it's a new life, and that is one that's an awakened life, as opposed to being asleep in addiction. Continuing with the text. Perception is a function of the body and therefore represents a limit on awareness. Perception sees through the body's eyes and hears through the body's ears. It evokes the limited responses which the body makes. The body appears to be largely self-motivated and independent, yet it actually responds only to the intentions of the mind. If the mind wants to use it for attack in any form, it becomes prey to sickness, age, and decay. If the mind accepts the Holy Spirit's purpose for it instead, it becomes a useful way of communicating with others, invulnerable as long as it is needed, and to be gently laid by when its use is over. Of itself, it is neutral, as is everything in the world of perception. Whether it is used for the goals of the ego or the Holy Spirit depends entirely on what the mind wants. Okay, so when it says the body appears to be self-motivated and independent, but it only responds to the intentions of the mind, in my book, I wrote that the body and the brain are like a radio receiver, and it doesn't send the signals. That's the mind that's sending the signals, and the body and the brain are receiving those signals. So they don't determine what gets sent. They just broadcast out what is being sent to it. So again, it says, of itself, it is neutral, as is everything in the world of perception. That goes back to what we were talking about when we were talking about the forest or the woods, that in and of itself, that is just neutral. It depends on the mind that's perceiving it, whether it becomes something useful in helping us to awaken or something fearful that keeps us stuck in separation. Continuing with the text. The opposite of seeing through the body's eyes is the vision of Christ, which reflects strength rather than weakness, unity rather than separation, and love rather than fear. The opposite of hearing through the body's ears is communication through the voice for God, the Holy Spirit, which abides in each of us. His voice seems distant and difficult to hear because the ego, which speaks for the little separated self, seems to be much louder. This is actually reversed. The Holy Spirit speaks with unmistakable clarity and overwhelming appeal. No one who does not choose to identify with the body could possibly be deaf to his messages of release and hope, nor could he fail to accept joyously the vision of Christ in glad exchange for his miserable picture of himself. And again, that first sentence, the opposite of seeing through the body's eyes is the vision of Christ. I just want you to get used to noticing that when the Course uses the word see, it's referring to the body, and when it refers to the vision, that's referring to a higher vision, the perspective of the Holy Spirit. Continuing with the text. Christ's vision is the Holy Spirit's gift, God's alternative to the illusion of separation and to the belief in the reality of sin, guilt, and death. It is the one correction for all errors of perception, the reconciliation of the seeming opposites on which this world is based. Its kindly light shows all things from another point of view, reflecting the thought system that arises from knowledge and making return to God not only possible but inevitable. What was regarded as injustices done to one by someone else now becomes a call for help and for union. Sin, sickness, and attack are seen as misperceptions, calling for remedy through gentleness and love. Defenses are laid down because where there is no attack, there is no need for them. Our brothers' needs become our own because they are taking the journey with us as we go to God. Without us, they would lose their way. Without them, we could never find our own. And again, that's referring to we need them in order to learn our own lessons of forgiveness. And in the top of that paragraph, where it's talking about the Holy Spirit, and it says it is the one correction for all errors of perception. The reason that it corrects all errors of perception is because the Course says there is only one error in perception. There's just a perception that there's a lot of errors in perception. So the one error in perception is that tiny mad idea, the thought of separation. And that's the one we keep reliving over and over and over again. Again, there's only one problem, which is the perception of separation. And therefore, there's only one solution, which is joining our mind with the mind of God or the Holy Spirit or Jesus, however you see that for yourself. In other words, we've forgotten who we are. And once you forget who you are, that's where all the trouble comes from. So the solution is that remembrance of who you are. And again, once you have that remembrance, your behavior in the world changes. What you do in the world is different. Continuing with the text. Forgiveness is unknown in heaven, where the need for it would be inconceivable. However, in this world, forgiveness is a necessary correction for all the mistakes that we have made. To offer forgiveness is the only way for us to have it, for it reflects the law of heaven that giving and receiving are the same. Heaven is the natural state of all the sons of God as He created them. Such is their reality forever. It has not changed because it has been forgotten. So, of course, forgiveness is unknown in heaven. In an awareness of oneness, there is no need to forgive. That's why it's only a tool that's necessary in a world of perception. Continuing with the text. Forgiveness is the means by which we will remember. Through forgiveness, the thinking of the world is reversed. The forgiven world becomes the gate of heaven, because by its mercy, we can at last forgive ourselves. Holding no one prisoner to guilt, we become free. Acknowledging Christ in all our brothers, we recognize His presence in ourselves. Forgetting all our misperceptions, and with nothing from the past to hold us back, we can remember God. Beyond this, learning cannot go. When we are ready, God Himself will take the final step in our return to Him. So when it says that through forgiveness, the thinking of the world is reversed, that's exactly what forgiveness does, is it sets things right. It sets things back to the truth, back to reality, that there is only oneness. Of course, in this world, that is reversed. In this world, there is no oneness. There is separation. Everything we see is outside of ourselves and separate from ourselves. We certainly don't walk by people thinking that they are at one with us. We obviously see them as separate people. Forgiveness reverses that thinking and has us overlook the separation to the truth that we are at one with our brothers. And the reason the forgiven world becomes the gate of heaven is because in that forgiveness, we create miracles. And it's those miracles, those shifts in perception that eventually bring us home, that eventually help us to remember the truth and wake up. And that's why forgiveness is the gate of heaven. So what does this mean to our daily lives? Well, I thought that maybe to end this episode, I would do a quick exercise with you. And that is, I'd like you to think of a specific situation in your life that's bugging you or unresolved, something that causes upset in you. And I'll wait while you do that. And now I want you to recognize that, quote, problem as a problem of separation. It's a manifested belief in separation. Therefore, the only solution to separation is joining. In other words, instead of seeing it as somebody did this to me, you see that the real problem is that I'm falling prey to the belief in separation and believing that somebody is doing something to me, when in fact the only problem here is the problem of separation from God in my own mind. And now lastly, surrender this issue to the Holy Spirit. Ask Him to heal your misperception, to see the situation as He would see it, rather than how your own ego is defining it. And I'll wait while you do that. Okay, we'll end there for today. And now we've finally arrived in the next podcast at the actual text of A Course in Miracles. And I'd love for you to join me in saying the summary of A Course in Miracles as we close today's podcast episode. Nothing real can be threatened. Nothing unreal exists. Herein lies the peace of God.